Real Estate Real Fast. I'm your host, Aaron Jistel. Thank you guys for joining me today. Real quick, a little bit about me. I'm the broker. I'm one of the co-founders here at ListingSpark. We're a tech-driven real estate platform. We help people sell their homes quickly, easily, save a ton of money in the process. Just try to simplify every flow of the real estate transaction. This podcast in particular is really geared towards a lot of real estate investment. So a lot of our listeners might be investors, might be some of our customers that are using us for the first time, trying to kind of navigate the selling process. Normally we have a guest on. Today you guys are stuck with just me. So TREC, the Texas Real Estate Commission, is coming out with some changes to our primary contracts and documents that we use. Those are going to be going live a week from today on February 1st. So I thought it was kind of timely to discuss those. We have a love-hate relationship with TREC. So for those of you that may not know, the way our contracts work in real estate in Texas is we use what are called promulgated documents, meaning these are universally adopted documents. We actually have to use TREC or TAR, Texas Association of Realtor, promulgated documents. We're not attorneys. So I'm going to give you my standard disclaimer. I'm a real estate broker. I'm not an attorney. I can't interpret what these contracts say and how that may affect you if there was a legal dispute and you had to go to court over these contracts. My goal here is to try to make sense of some of these changes, kind of talk through how that may affect a home seller or a home buyer, and then also go through some sections of these contracts that haven't been changed that I think maybe should, and kind of talk through some things that are still, I think, can be very confusing without putting a little color around them and explaining them. So in typical TREC fashion, a lot of these contracts are about as clear as mud. And, they're that way by design. So these are meant to be universally used for the vast majority of transactions. They're meant to be all encompassing. They're 10 pages. Most of it is not applicable to the transaction you may be doing in real time, but maybe for some future transaction down the road. So there's a lot of this stuff in this contract that is jargon that may or may not be even relevant to your transaction, but it's in here. So in that regard, I'm going to jump right in and start talking through what some of these changes are. So the first thing we're going to be looking at is the TREC 1-4. It's called the 1-4 because that means 1 to 4 units. So single family residential, duplex, triplex, fourplex. This is not meant to be multifamily. And there's a separate contract if you're using a condo. Most of the condo contracts are going to mimic the 1-4. They are just going to also kind of absorb language that is included in the HOA addendum. So we'll kind of go through the HOA addendum as well. And so that should really cover most of the changes in the condo contracts as well. So the first one, and I can appreciate this change and I actually like it. So in the first page, section 3, they make a change to what is called the cash portion of the sale, or this is a buyer's down payment. If they're paying cash, they're going to have the entirety of the purchase price listed on that first line. And so they put a little bit of a more defined definition of what cash means. So before it just said cash portion of sales price payable by buyer at closing. So what they're adding is the term cash portion of the sales price does not include proceeds from borrowing of any kind or selling other real property except as disclosed in this contract. The reason why that is an important change, an important distinction, is if you know anything about the real estate investment world, you'll know a lot of real estate investors will use hard money, private money. And a lot of times they will position that as being cash because it's not a conforming Fannie Freddie loan. It is, it's hard money in the sense that it doesn't come with the same restrictions, guidelines, regulations. And so a lot of times we will have this kind of gray area where you might see a buyer who's getting hard money put down that they're a cash buyer. And then they kind of back that up with a hard money proof of funds or letter or something that goes along with there. So in my opinion, this makes the ability to do that a little bit more challenging, because technically, in my opinion at least, and again, my non-lawyer opinion, that would fall under the category of being proceeds from borrowing any kind of money or selling other real property except as disclosed in this contract. So meaning you can't put a down payment, or you can't put your cash down payment down unless you actually have that cash. You can't say, I'm going to have this cash because of a future property I'm going to sell, or I'm taking a loan out and I'm kind of calling that loan cash because I consider it to be cash equivalent. You'll notice TREC doesn't say what the repercussions are if it were to be found out that the buyer put something in here as their cash down payment and it wasn't. It doesn't specifically list what those repercussions are. And again, TREC does that on purpose. They don't, if there's a dispute that becomes a legal dispute, they want buyer and seller to hash that out in court and have that be a one-off situation. And so, if you wanted to continue going that route, let's say you're an investor and you're buying and you're feeling like getting hard money allows you to put that hard money amount under the cash equivalent. This makes that a little more murky. If you continue to do it, I couldn't tell you exactly what would happen if the seller kind of called you out on it, or if it hit the fan and you were trying to get your earnest money back and they found out you really didn't have that cash, how that might affect you and your ability to get your earnest money back. So again, this is more of a discussion of the change. And that's a worthy topic to discuss maybe with an attorney and say how that could negatively affect you if that's something you've been doing on the purchasing side. I think as a seller, it can really allow you to start calling into question some dicier down payments that are backed with maybe some sketchy proof of funds. So let's just say that. So first big change to keep an eye out is what exactly is cash. Moving on down to notices. So this was a change that has been kind of talked about a lot. So a lot of people don't realize that if you look through these contracts and you kind of go through the sea of pages that don't really have a whole lot of things to fill in, and again, it's mostly legal jargon in there, talks about a lot of notices. So all of section 6 is essentially notices. And these are notices to buyer, notices that seller should provide to the buyer. And they added a whole new section, and it's section 11 called required notices. And it's the following notices have been given or are attached to this contract. For example, MUD, WCID, or PID notices. And so what that means is if you're in a MUD or a municipal utility district, you have to provide a MUD notice to the buyer, either attached to the contract, or you have to give it to the buyer before you have an executed agreement. Same with a WCID. If you don't know what a WCID is, it's a water control and improvement district, and which is essentially a limited independent government with the authority to purchase, construct, maintain infrastructure, things like that. And so a lot of these abbreviated terms, whether it's a MUD, a PUD, a PID, a WCID, essentially what that means is there's some level of infrastructure or government, typically that is a taxing authority, that's going to have some effect on what expenses are paid by the buyer through either taxes, assessments, things like that. So you're, as a seller, required to give those notices to the buyer upfront in advance. If you don't, a buyer can arguably have the right to pull out of that contract for any reason up until closing and get their earnest money back. So I've seen that before with a buyer who got a MUD notice and used that as a loophole to get out of the deal. They wanted to get out of the deal anyway. They were past their option period. They were past any of their contingencies. The hilarious thing about it was the MUD document that ultimately had to get provided to them showed a tax amount of like a couple bucks for the whole year, almost nothing. But the buyer said, yep, well, you guys are supposed to get this to me before we executed. For that reason, I'm terminating. Give me all my money back. And so this is a loophole a buyer can find. You need to close that loophole. You can find, if you don't know that you're in a mud, it's good to contact your title company. At our title company, Spark Title, we have ways to look this up, whether or not you're in a mud district or a public utility district or things like that. But it is important to get that notice out up front. And this contract is now going to make that a little bit more clear. I really like this one because in the past, this was not clearly stated in the contract, but yet it was still a loophole that buyers could use. And so it put a seller at a disadvantage because they might not even know that that was something they had to find and get and provide to the buyer. So I think this is another one of those examples of TREC actually doing a good job and finding a little clarity there. Okay, so the next one I want to talk about, this actually isn't a change. If I were one of TREC's attorneys in drafting alternatives to this contract, this would be one of those sections of the contract that I would probably like to see a little bit more description or color around. And this is section 7D, where we talk about the property, the buyer accepting the property as is. Or there's another section where the next section is buyer accepts the property as is, provided the seller at seller's expense shall complete the following specific repairs and treatments. So in this contract, you essentially have two options. The buyer's accepting it as is, or they have to check the following box. They have to actually list out what repairs or what things they want the seller to do. How in the hell could the buyer possibly know what they want the seller to do before they've had the property inspected, before they've had their due diligence period? It's impossible. So what ends up happening? The first box gets checked on 99.9% of contracts where the buyer accepts the property as is. I can't tell you how many sellers then get extremely agitated when during the option period, the buyer asks for repairs. And they're like, no, we have an agreement. Buyer said they were buying it as is. I'm not doing anything. We have this in writing. Well, you don't, and you didn't. And here's why. We have to look at the buyer as if they're an average lay person on the street, right? We can't reasonably expect that they have any kind of intimate knowledge about the foundation, the roof, the structural, mechanical, plumbing. They just don't. They're just your average Joe walking into a house, walking around your house. They have no idea what even could be broken. They certainly have no idea what's up to code and what's not up to code. And we can't reasonably expect that. So what we would reasonably expect is if they have an issue with the paint, yeah, you could put that in the section. We want you to paint the house. It looks like crap. If there's pet stains all over the carpet, hey, we want you to replace the carpet. I get that. Anything from an aesthetic perspective, that is really what that section 2 is meant for. So the buyer during the inspection shouldn't come back and ask for aesthetic things. I want you to replace the countertops. I want you to paint this room. Any buyer could walk around and see that stuff. We're really more talking about what are the things that either A, they couldn't see, or B, even if they could see it, how would they even know that it's a problem or broken, right? And so the reality of it is that none of these contracts are really as is, and we shouldn't pretend like they are. And so as a seller, if you really want your transaction to be considered as is, that needs to be extremely vocally presented to the buyer. They should know that up front. Like, I'm signing off on this price. I'm coming down for you. But listen, you can get it inspected. I'm not doing anything. There's going to be no repairs. There's nothing as is, whereas the sale is don't ask for anything because you're not going to get it, right? That needs to be very clearly stated. If it goes unsaid and you just sign this contract, that box being checked as is not going to get you there, right? Nor should we reasonably expect it to. Now, from a strategy perspective, personally, I don't think it's a good idea for a seller to be really bullish and obtuse about a buyer purchasing the house as is. If it's a fire sale, if the house is trashed and it's obvious and it's a fixer and there's no question about it, I get it. On a traditional retail resale sale, even if it's a flip or whatever, really pushing a buyer to agree to an as-is sale is sketchy. It is a red flag. It is going to make a buyer second guess whether or not they should do that, right? Because it feels like you're hiding something. You're wanting to bulldoze through their option period and basically get them to agree without any kind of a professional inspection that they're going to take it as is. I certainly wouldn't use that as a strategy if I'm selling a house. I would want the buyer to feel comfortable that they have an option period. They can go get it inspected. If a problem arises, I'm going to be reasonable about it. I'm not going to roll over and just give away the farm, but I'm going to be reasonable about it. Because in reality, every one of us that owns a home has something wrong with our house that we don't know about. We don't climb up on the roof on a regular basis. We're not looking at the eaves and the trim. Maybe it's been a while since we've had our HVAC serviced. We don't know if there's a deficiency on the water heater. We just don't know. But a lot of times what happens is the buyer brings something to our attention. And you go, you know what? I had no idea about that. I certainly wasn't trying to hide it. That's reasonable. I'll fix it. I'll give you credit. That's kind of the way it should be. So just know it's not as is. It's never as is. It's not going to be as is. An as-is sale is rare. It's really meant for a junker of a house. So just keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. Okay, moving on down. This one is also in section 7. This is a change to the contract. And again, I'm going to give TREC some kudos on this because I do think this provides a little bit of clarity that wasn't in previous version of this contract. And this has to do with providing proof of repairs. So you're under contract, buyer does their inspection, they ask for a repair, you agree to that repair. What is now required of you as the seller to perform on the contract with these changes? So the way that it reads is the new language says seller shall, 1, provide buyer with copies of documentation from the repair person or persons showing the scope of work and payment for the work completed, and 2, at seller's expense, arrange for the transfer of any transferable warranties. And then there's some other language on that with respect to the repairs and treatments to buyer at closing. So essentially what that means is the key words in this that I really want our sellers and our investors to hear is your invoice, which should be a paid in full invoice. So we get a lot of invoices that still show a balance, and that might have the scope of work, but it doesn't show that the work is paid for. And again, this is usually not the buyer being obtuse. Of course, every buyer would reasonably want to know that the repairs are done. But the lender is going to want to see this. This is contractually obligated repairs in an amendment. So the house is collateral for a massive dollar amount that's a mortgage. The lender's going to want to see the repairs are done. And so they're going to want to see an invoice that shows the complete scope of work, which includes line items of what was on the amendment. And then they're going to want to see that it's paid in full. The work is completed. We have also had some ticky-tacky back and forth sometimes between buyer and seller, where maybe a roof company will extend a warranty, but they charge a fee to have the warranty transferred or whatever. This is saying pretty clearly that's a seller expense. If there's a warranty, you have to give it to the buyer. And if there's a transfer fee to get that warranty, the seller has to pay for it. Okay. The other thing about this section is this is already pre-existing language that I feel like gets very, very, very glossed over. It precedes the clause that I just read. So I'm going to read this very carefully, and I want to make sure we're unpacking this. Unless otherwise agreed in writing. That's an important clause. Unless otherwise agreed in writing. If you don't want to agree to this, you have to put it in writing. Seller shall complete all agreed repairs and treatments prior to. Sorry, guys, got bumped out for a second. Okay, let's see. Let me go back to that. Seller shall complete all agreed repairs and treatments prior to the closing date and obtain any and all required permits. That's a big word. The P word is like a bad word for a lot of investors out there. It's in this contract, any and all required permits. The repairs and treatments must be performed by persons who are licensed to provide such repairs or treatments, or if no license is required by law, are commercially engaged in the trade of providing such repairs or treatments. So what that means to me is if it requires a license, you need to use somebody with a license. If it doesn't, they have to prove that they're commercially engaged in that trade, meaning there's no license, there's no governing body that licenses that, but they've got to show that that's something they do, that they are proficient in. They understand what they're doing, right? And so I think a lot of people really need to read that section very closely. The other thing for your investors that are also do-it-yourselfers, if you think you're going to go do these repairs yourself, then that first sentence, unless otherwise agreed in writing. So let's say you know your way around light plumbing, light electrical. I'm not saying I recommend it. I've owned my house. I've owned several other houses. There's a lot of work that I don't have a license for that I know I'm capable of doing, that if I'm not intending on selling that house, I'm going to do those repairs myself before I pay somebody a ton of money per hour. But what I'm saying is, if you're going to do that, the buyer needs to be made aware of it. You need to let them know in writing, I'm going to do these repairs. You're not the licensing authority. You may not know whether or not you need a license. But it is very important that the buyer understands who's completing those repairs. And if it's you or somebody that doesn't have a license, the buyer should be made aware of that. That's the right and ethical thing to do. So read this very carefully. All of these contracts can be found on the TREC website. These are public domain documents. The Texas Real Estate Commission is a governing body that really is meant to protect the public, not just be there to lay down rules and punishments for agents and brokerages. They're really meant to be a consumer protection agency. All of these contracts are available to the general public on the TREC website. So Section 7, read it carefully. Okay, let's move on down. So Section 9.5, let's see, HOA language. So this is another important one. Private transfer fees, as defined by Chapter 5, Subchapter G of the Texas Property Code, you guys can look that one up, will be the obligation of the seller unless provided otherwise in this contract. Transfer fees assessed by a property owners association are governed by the addendum for property subject to mandatory membership in a property owners association. So we're going to get to the HOA addendum here in a little bit. In this addendum, what can get confusing about this is, the addendum talks about three main fees. We have a document section where the seller typically provides the buyer the HOA documents, rules and regs, bylaws, all that stuff. It doesn't have to be the seller. It's negotiable. You can check a box where the buyer provides it, or the buyer can waive their right to get it and not require the seller to provide it for them. But that's the main section, HOA docs, bylaws. You have transfer fees, and then you have the resale certificate, which is essentially the financials and the accounting that the title company is going to have to go on. So, we all know HOAs for the most part are like the mafia, right? You don't really know what you're getting. They're constantly up your, what, when it comes to your own property. And then when you go to sell your house, you've always got to pay a bunch of money that you don't quite understand why or what it's going towards. And the reality of it is we know it's usually somebody's going to pay them $500 to $600 for clicking a few buttons and filling in a few blanks on a computer. It's annoying, but the reality of it is part of every sale. That's not changing anytime soon. You can actually go down the rabbit hole and find some pretty wild government corruption in HOAs. You'd be surprised how many politicians are in bed with HOA management companies or have ownership stakes and all that. If you wanted to get really conspiracy theorists, go down that wormhole. But anyway, you sell a house, you got to pay a bunch to your HOA. There's no way around it. So what has become problematic, as is any organization that is, has become, let's face it, for profit, they're gonna start trying to find fees in other areas where they can collect money. So you're gonna find one-time working capital fees. You're gonna have all kinds of other fees that historically we had three fees: docs, transfer, resale, cert. And now there's working capital. There's all, there's crazy ones on there. And who pays for that? So what this is really meant to describe is, let's actually read it on here. So this paragraph, when it's talking about the transfer fees, the new language is, this paragraph does not apply to regular periodic maintenance fees, assessments, or dues, including prepaid items that are prorated by paragraph 13, and costs and fees provided by paragraphs A and D. So A and D is the document section, and the D is the resale certificate. So essentially what that is meaning is section C is meant to say, I'm a buyer, I'm agreeing to pay up to $250 in transfer fees, and seller, it's on you to pay the rest. So what can you do to make sure you know what you're going to pay? It's actually quite simple. Call your HOA. I mean, call them up and say, I'm selling my house. What am I going to owe? You're going to find out if they have that crazy 1% working capital fee, or if they have sometimes they do an inspection fee. Somebody has to come out and inspect the property and charge a fee for that. Just call them and ask them. Know that going in. That's the only way you're going to be able to negotiate it properly. But just understand that, usually when the buyer puts their cap is going to be 150 or 250, and it ends up being more, and you're trying to push that onto the buyer, it's a guarantee they're going to have a problem with it. So get that information up front and kind of understand how that's going to affect your bottom line. All right, special provisions. If you're asking me as a broker, out of 100 transactions in a perfect world, 99 of them don't have anything in the special provisions line. It's a pet peeve of mine. I train all my agents and all my people that they should not be filling out information in the special provisions section of the contract, because most of the time it is either an agent, a buyer, or a seller trying to put their lawyer hat on when they're not a lawyer, and they write confusing language. And where it gets super problematic is when you write language that's conflicting into other sections of the contract. And then if shit hits the fan, which provision or which clause is going to be the binding one if you wrote something in that conflicts that. If it's an agent writing it in and it causes a big issue between a buyer and seller, well, that agent just did the unlicensed practice of law, and they're going to be on the hook for it, and that's a big problem. So the language that they changed in here, I'll read it out to you word for word. This paragraph is intended to be used only for additional informational items. Informational items, I think, is the key word. An informational item is a statement that completes a blank in a contract form. So, for example, maybe that blank, you don't have enough room to fill it in. The subdivision is a lot longer. The legal description is longer than you might be able to fit. You can fill in the blank in the special provisions. An informational item is a statement that completes a blank in a contract form, discloses factual information, or provides instructions. Real estate brokers and sales agents are prohibited from practicing law and shall not add to, delete, or modify any provisions of this contract unless drafted by a party of this contract or a party's attorney. So any agents listening in, and I hope you heard that and are taking a mental note. The last sentence is important here, though. Any provisions of this contract unless drafted by a party to this contract. Who is a party to the contract? Buyer and seller, right? We are brokers or agents brokering a sale and a transaction. We're not parties to the contract. Buyer and seller are. That means you can add stuff in here. So if a seller wants me to put something in special provisions, I'm going to tell them, you can write it in. You can have your attorney write it in. I'm not going to write it in. I'll make sure you are able to write it in, and I'm usually going to drop an extra little initial there to make sure it's very clear that that language came from you and not me, because I'm not going to be held responsible for, again, any conflicting language that's going to be put in there. But just know special provisions is meant to fill in blanks. It's meant to clarify any gray areas. It's not meant for you guys to go become at-home lawyers and write in a bunch of confusing stuff, have penalties for not answering to an offer by a certain amount of time or a deadline. or all these other things, right? Just keep it clean. It should realistically be empty. Okay, we already talked about the HOA addendum and the transfer fees. Hopefully you guys have some clarity around that. Okay, let's talk about the third-party financing addendum. There's a pretty significant change in here. So we already talked about, they put a little bit of clarity around what a cash offer means. And so on the third-party financing addendum, I think they also did a good job covering, what kind of something that might be considered creative financing. So historically on the third-party financing addendum, they had a section for a conventional loan, a Texas Veterans loan, an FHA loan, a VA loan, a USDA loan, and a reverse mortgage. And then it stopped. Okay, so they added a whole section for other financing. Okay, what is other financing? I don't know. They actually don't give a definition for what it is. What I'm gonna take a guess at would be private financing, non-conforming financing, probably hard money. I think could get lumped into that category. It's just not one of those other categories. So if you're getting a loan and it doesn't fit in one of those other boxes, that is going to be G, other financing. And so again, good on TREC. I mean, that was a gap in the contract and the third-party financing addendum that got filled. So other financing is considered a loan, not of a type described above, from, and then you can name the lender. So let's say it was a person or a private lender, in the principal amount of blank, due in blank. So, I mean, you list out the terms, same way you would in a conventional loan. And so I think this is a great section to be included in here. It does clean up a lot of ambiguity around kind of personal or private loans. We're going to talk a little bit about some other aspects of the third-party financing addendum that actually aren't changes, but again, I think are things that can get really confusing, and I'd like to offer a little bit of clarity around. By the way, you guys chime in the chat. Austin, I appreciate you chiming in. I'm going to definitely answer your question here in a minute. If you guys have questions, throw them in there. We'll do some Q&A at the end and answer any other questions you have. Let's see. But really quick, Austin, answer yours. Will all the new verbiage be carried over to the TXR forms? I'm not sure. TAR or the Texas Realtor forms, they do differ from TREC. There may be some changes in there. These are all, in my understanding, are TREC specific. So not 100% on that. That is a good question. If you go to TREC's website, there's a lot that are going to be changed. I'm going with the ones that are going to be, the law of averages are going to say these are the most commonly used contracts and addendums. So I wanted to cover those. It is changing contracts for lots and seller financing addendums and all kinds of stuff. So TREC does a good job of providing the existing form, and then they actually show the draft, and you can see here it says draft, and then you can see on here it's red line changes, and then in blue it shows you what the new language is. So I think they do a really good job of showing what's changing. Okay, so the two things I want to talk about on the second page of the third-party financing addendum that, in my opinion, cause all kinds of problems are, in my opinion, the number one reason why we're fighting over earnest money after we're 2 to 3 weeks into the contract. And there are two sections called buyer approval and property approval. And I think these can get very, very, very confusing. In my mind, they're actually pretty simple, but I can understand why people get confused. Mostly people get confused because they don't freaking read it. So I'm gonna read it to you, because I think if you actually read it out loud, you'll realize how simple this kind of stuff is. So buyer approval, okay, this is also known as the buyer's financing contingency period, is what most people are going to call this at. It's usually going to be 14 to 21 days. That's kind of on average. I say 21 days, kind of high side of normal. 14 days is more in the norm. If you see less than that, that's considered really strong. That means the lender's got their stuff together, the buyer's got their stuff together. But that reads, this contract is subject to buyer obtaining buyer approval. If buyer cannot obtain buyer approval, buyer may give written notice to seller within X amount of days after the effective date of the contract, and this contract will terminate and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. If buyer does not terminate the contract under this provision, the contract shall no longer be subject to the buyer obtaining buyer approval. The buyer approval will be deemed to have been obtained when, 1, the terms of the loan described above are available and lender determines that buyer has satisfied all of lender's requirements related to buyer's assets, income, and credit history. So I get that that's not totally clear. I mean, the first one, the terms of the loan described above are available. Like, why would they become unavailable? It happens. Loan, they haven't locked, and then the rate changes and it screws up their debt to income ratio, and now they can't qualify. That could happen. They have something that adversely affects their credit. They become unqualified during that period and they can't get the loan. So how do they prove that? Their lender writes a denial letter. They present that within that time prescribed, and it's pretty cut and dry. They get their earnest money back, right? That's the buyer approval. That means the lender has approved the buyer. They're not talking about the property. They're talking about the buyer, okay? Property approval. If buyer's lender determines that the property does not satisfy lender's underwriting requirements for the loan, including but not limited to appraisal, insurability, and lender required repairs, buyer not later than 3 days before the closing may terminate this contract by giving seller notice of termination and a copy of a written statement from the lender setting forth the reasons for determination. If buyer terminates under this paragraph, the earnest money will be refunded to buyer. If buyer does not terminate under this paragraph, property approval is deemed to have been obtained. So, typically what's going to happen is you have the buyer approval period, and then the appraisal is going to happen. And the appraisal, let's say the value kills the deal. Based on that appraisal, the lender will no longer give the loan based on the value. Or let's say the appraiser goes out and they find that there's signs of molds, or the roof is caving in, or the property doesn't meet the requirements of a VA loan or an FHA loan or something like that. That would be the reason why the property doesn't meet the approval. You'll notice that doesn't fall in the same deadline as the buyer approval. So the buyer contingency period is only for the buyer's ability to qualify under their own income, assets, and creditworthiness. The other is it's 3 days prior to closing. So just read this stuff, understand it. If you have questions, ask questions. But that's definitely something that you guys, it's not a change. It's just things that I think are cause a lot of drama at the end. And if you knew what you were reading and understanding it, it wouldn't be nearly as much headache, and there wouldn't be as many fights over earnest money at the end. Okay, last thing, for an FHA or a VA loan, we get this all the time. If you haven't accepted a VA or an FHA contract in a long time, the market's softening up. Maybe you're going to get outside of what you normally do. And maybe for a while you've only accepted conventional, and now you're maybe going to look at an FHA or a VA loan. I think you should. We sell houses all the time with buyers that do FHA or VA. They're great programs for veterans. FHA loans are great loans for people that are first-time home buyers. Maybe they don't have a ton of money in the bank, and they have a good job that gives them a steady paycheck. They can qualify, but they don't have a ton of cash. It obviously has a lower down payment. There's a lot of good reasons why you should entertain an FHA or a VA, but you have to understand there's differences. And one of those is Section 4 of the third-party financing addendum. The property is going to have to appraise for the value. And this is another thing that we see all the time. Back in the heyday of 2021, where everybody wanted an appraisal waiver, and they wanted to say the buyer's going to buy the property no matter what it appraises for, and the buyer was demanding that happen, you'll notice on that addendum that only qualifies for a conventional loan. On an FHA or a VA, you can't use that addendum, and you cannot contractually require a buyer to buy the property no matter what it appraises for. At least that's the way I read this. Again, I'm not a lawyer. So typically, you got to fill in a value here, and it's usually going to be the sales price. A buyer can elect to put a lower number in there if they want to, but usually it's very common that it's going to be the sales price. And then what's going to happen is that lender is going to circulate maybe a week in, maybe 2 weeks in, maybe 2 days before closing. We don't control it. It comes from the lender. They're going to submit either an FHA or a VA amendatory clause document. And then we send that out to our seller, and then they go crazy and go, what the hell is this? Why am I getting this last minute? This is essentially giving the buyer an out to the contract. Why would I ever sign this? Because you've already signed it. It's just regurgitating what you've already agreed to. The lender doesn't work on our timeline when it comes to the contracts, but that is a document that they have to have in their file to fund the loan. It is a mandatory document for a federally insured loan, FHA or VA. If you don't sign it, you don't close. But don't freak out because it's essentially a term you've already agreed to in the contract. So again, the more you know, the less you freak out when you see these documents at the last minute. Lenders, if you're listening in, do me a favor, send this thing out early, man. The earlier you send it out, the less drama it's going to cause. I know it's strange because you guys do this every single day and you send that document out on every single loan, but I can tell you it freaks out sellers. They think the buyers are trying to push something past them. They think something's wrong with a loan and they're trying to find a loophole at the very last second. Send it out early. It just calms everybody down. And all you're doing is reaffirming what you've already agreed to. All right. God, unbelievable. Already 40 minutes. That's wild. I really hate listening to myself talk for that long. I appreciate you guys hanging in there. If you have any other questions, chime in. Austin, I appreciate the love, man. Hope you're doing well. Hope business is prosperous. Thanks for chiming in. Thanks for the kind words, buddy. Appreciate you. I know this was kind of a more boring topic for your average homeowner, but for us that are doing this on a daily basis, and we got to stare at these damn contracts and addendums every single day, this stuff is actually kind of interesting to us. You know, we can kind of nerd out on this stuff a little bit because this actually does kind of affect our day-to-day and how we operate. So knowledge is power. It's important to stay up to date on this stuff. If you guys have any questions, track us down, ListingSpark.com. You can send us a note through the site. You can chat in. I'm pretty available, pretty easy to find me. Find me on social media as well. But guys, I really appreciate you joining us. Again, this has been another episode of Real Estate Real Fast. We try to push these out live every Wednesday at 1 o'clock. This is episode 13. That's crazy to think about. We've already done 13 of these. We've had a lot of different guests. We have lenders, we have inspectors, we have Airbnb specialists, we have all kinds of stuff. Check us out on Apple or Spotify if you want to listen to some previous podcasts. Hopefully we're getting better at this over as we do more of them. And hopefully you'll join us again next time. Thanks again, guys.